Following up on the conference theme of Shakespeare's women, I propose to discuss Shakespeare's women in the Audley End Annotations. Now, my title presupposes some knowledge of what the Audley End Annotations are, but if this idea is a little new to you, have no fear, we will recoup the basics. On my title slide here, this is Shivas Michael and Joachina Kalukango and Jonathan Cake in Antony and Cleopatra at the Public Theater in New York. I'm not sure of the year of the performance. So although there is a long foreground, our abbreviated story begins with the history of this 2016 book by John Casson and William Rubenstein. For several years before this book appeared in print, there were rumors of a quote-unquote another aristocrat who, it was persistently implied, would prove to make a stronger case for the real authorship of the plays than Edward de Vere. Even some Oxfordians joined in these rumors. Proponents of such views never engaged in any sustained criticism of the Oxfordian argument, even though it was first effectively presented, as you know, in 1920, and has since grown to include a formidable body of evidence and argument, effectively counteracting many of the strongest arguments of traditional Shakespeareans, and demonstrating that leading early modern writers such as Francis Mears, Ben Jonson, and Michael Drayton knew quite well, and told us so, that de Vere was the primary, if not the only author of the plays. I emphasize this history to make a point about the need for peer review of prior scholarship. Although the case for de Vere is sometimes contested on the grounds that he was a wretched poet and he died before some of the plays were written, it is, of course, the case that the actual facts of the case are, at their worst, more complicated than that. All theories generate anomalies, and until a new model has been thoroughly vetted and either confirmed or disproven, it does have a standing that subsequent models must encounter before they can expect to be considered plausible. But despite a confused presentation, this book had one thing going for it. It contained several photographs of annotations in books at Audley End, a great estate in Essex, an hour northeast of London, that indeed appeared to have an intimate, startling connection to at least two of Shakespeare's Roman plays. There were also early rumors from advocates of the anybody could have written the plays school of reasoning. It was 3 years before I learned of Casson and Rubenstein's book. I had my nose in multiple Oxfordian projects, several of which have subsequently been published. It wasn't until the 2019 SOF meeting in Hartford, Connecticut, appropriately enough at the Mark Twain House, that I learned of this book's existence. Some of you may remember this quotation from Mark Twain's Is Shakespeare Dead that I used in my talk at the Twain House in that year. And I also said I would fail Professor Shapiro for not knowing what he is talking about when it comes to the Shakespeare question. Twain, we know, was a vigorous, no, a relentless, a savage, a damning critic of the Stratfordian theme park school of authorship. So this is part of the dialogues going on here between Twain and his Stratfordian colleague. He said, I was silent for a while, and I knew what was happening. He was losing his temper, and I knew that he would presently close the session with the same old argument that was always his stay and support. That's a little Elizabethan or Shakespearean thing right there, that stay and support in his time of need. The same old argument, the one I couldn't answer because I dazzled. The argument that I was an ass and better shut up. He delivered and I obeyed. To make a long story short, Dr. Jan Scheffer, who I believe is here, came up to me at this conference and said, I think these annotations are by Oxford. Well, he was right. The annotations in question are not by Sir Henry Neville, as Casson and Rubenstein claimed. They are by Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And this I have argued in copious detail in an 18,000-word, longest academic article I have ever published in the Journal of Forensic Document Examination, the professional journal of the Association of Board-Certified Forensic Document Analysts. And this is available for free on my website and maybe even some other places on the web. I'm just going to do one slide to talk about handwriting here, and then we're going to get on to Shakespeare's women in these annotations. Double S, which is what you see here, these are all examples of Elizabethan double S's, is a really useful combination of letters to use in determining the probability that two samples are by the same writer. That's because, first of all, S exists in two forms. You can see the long and the short form. And then there are various ways of trying to combine those. So there are at least 5 major types or ways of doing a double S in early English writing, of which 3 of them are visible on this side. So the first illustration on your right, on top, illustrates what I classified as type 3. And these are very rare in both of the samples. That is a long S and a short S with no connection between them. You can see in the right-hand column, the de Vere column over there, that a more common way that he makes this combination is a long and a short with a connection between the 2 letters. A ligature, it is called. But if you look at that first table, you will see that the most common way of making this combination of letters in Sir Henry Neville's handwriting is what I call a cursive form. And in the cursive forms that you see on the bottom of that table, the pen never leaves the page. So the difference between the double S with the ligature and the cursive is quite a different hand motion. In the ligatured form, the pen leaves the page before the second S is begun. So that table already tells us that it is improbable that Sir Henry Neville is the author of these annotations because although there's a little bit of commonality, the main forms are quite distinct. And on the left-hand side, we have the Audley End annotator compared to de Vere. And here we see a dramatic match. Now, there are a couple differences that we might observe here. The forms, the types are the same. Anybody see a difference between these 2 samples? Yes. That is correct. The slant is different, and there's one other difference. Anybody see the other difference? So the Audley End forms are written with a wider pen nib. They have greater variation in the thickness of the line. Now, it turns out that one of the things I did in this study was I proved why the slant is different. The width of the pen is just a variable, but the reason the slant is different is that the de Vere sample is written on a complete sheet of paper. The hand is moving across the page rather rapidly. That's his natural slant. But when he writes in the margin of a book, even a book with margins of 2 inches, which is these books have, he's writing more slowly, and the forms just tip closer to 90 degrees. And I'm happy to talk more about the handwriting if anybody wants to. So what is Audley End and why is it important? This is mostly 17th century English manor house near Saffron Walden in Essex. It's only about 20 miles from Castle Hedingham, by the way, the ancestral state, as you know, of the Earls of Oxford. Today, the estate is co-owned under a cooperative engagement by the heirs of the Earls of Braybrook and English Heritage, the national trust that manages many national historic landmarks in Britain. And this is among the grandest surviving examples of Jacobean architecture, nestled in a spacious landscape of field and forest. Originally, the house was built on the site of a 12th century Benedictine abbey, which is where the name Audley comes from. Audley was the original builder. On Queen Elizabeth's 1578 summer visit to the estate, the Cambridge Don Gabriel Harvey, later to be lampooned in Love's Labour's Lost as Holofernes and as Pedantius in the Trinity College play by that name, delivered several long speeches in praise of the Queen and several other court nobles. And in one of these speeches, this one to the Earl of Oxford, he praised him as one whose countenance shakes a spear. And I would just recommend anybody, if someone ever tells you that's a bad translation of Latin used in the speech because it was originally delivered in Latin, I would recommend Andy Hannis's article, which is available on the SOF website, Gabriel Harvey and the Genesis of William Shakespeare. Now, importantly, for our purposes, in the same speech, he fulsomely praises de Vere's fluency in Latin. We will come back to that point. So Audley End is the kind of house you can imagine Twelfth Night taking place in. It's a huge place that could host, under the auspices of a benevolent Olivia, Sir Toby, Aguecheek, and even Feste, and it could, in fact, sleep the entire court on progress. Starting around 1610, Thomas Howard, the first Earl of Suffolk, demolished the original grounds and rebuilt on the grand scale seen in the left-hand image. The image on the right is the way the house looks today, and you can see this massive courtyard no longer is there. That Jacobean magnificence did not survive, and in the 17th century, the footprint of the house was scaled back to what it is today. This estate is only a quarter mile from the charming village of Saffron Walden, so-called from the early tradition of growing saffron, a spice made as valuable as gold by weight, more valuable by weight than gold. Amusingly, along with so much other local color and detail in the plays, in Winter's Tale, the charming rogue Autolycus includes saffron, along with nutmeg, ginger, and raisins in his shopping list for an upcoming feast. And, of course, a stunning interest of Shakespeare's broad cultural appeal and powers of artistic inspiration reminds us that the phrase raisins of the sun will be translated first by Langston Hughes in his poem Harlem, and then by Lorraine Hansberry in her blockbuster 1959, A Raisin in the Sun. The photo is my cat, Earl Grey, sitting in the sunroom on top of a puzzle of Saffron Walden, which I put together. It was the hardest puzzle I've ever done. So one way to get from Saffron Walden to Audley End is by car. And on our first visit, our gracious host, Dorna Bewley, met us each morning at our Cross Key Inn lodgings and drove us around to the front gate. That is, of course, myself and my wife, Shelley. On our second trip to Audley End, Shelley and I found our way to the house along the footpath leading from our lodgings at the Cross Key Inn across fields and forest to the hill overlooking the back end of Audley End. To walk, you must first pass through the gate that leads into the estate from the property of the town. From there, a quarter mile of trail threads its way through fields and wilds. Shards and nodules of flint everywhere peep out from under the rich soils of the estate farmland. And so many of the ideas that I'm about to discuss to you were originally explored on that path. So, to the annotations, let's start with the real blockbuster here. Now, notice, oh, this is in Greek, okay? But you can see the translation. This says the character of Mark Antony, and you see the bracket, and in the middle of the bracket, it says Antithesis, and then at the bottom, it says the character of Cleopatra. The word that I'm translating here as character is actually phusis. Some people might argue with that translation. More literally, it is nature. But if you look up the words nature and character in Shakespeare, you will quickly see that he uses the word nature where we would use the word character. And as Sky Gilbert reminds us, quote, one of the most common rhetorical techniques utilized by Shakespeare is antithesis. It is difficult to find a page in a play by Shakespeare that does not contain it. Shakespeare seems compelled, when speaking of one thing, to also think of its opposite. And traditional scholar Anne Barton agrees. Throughout his working life, Shakespeare displayed a marked predilection for analyzing situations by way of contraries or antitheses. Certain words seem to summon up their opposites almost automatically, as much the result of an ingrained habit of mind as from the requirements of a particular situation or rhetorical pattern. This is the case especially with the true-false antitheses, as even a quick glance at the two words in the Shakespeare Concordance will reveal. So antithesis, here expressed in Greek on the page, is perhaps Shakespeare's most fundamental strategy for exploring a topic in multiple dimensions. So I said I was going to talk about Shakespeare's women in the Audley End Annotations, and we just saw a note about Cleopatra, and we will come back to Cleopatra because she is certainly the most prominent female in these annotations. But let's start with Portia. This says in Latin, concerning Portia, wife to Brutus and daughter of Cato. Now, it's quite remarkable that actually Shakespeare conceives of Portia in exactly these terms. Oh, Portia conceives of herself in these terms, in these lines. She says to her husband, I grant I am a woman, but withal a woman that Lord Brutus took to wife. I grant I am a woman, but withal a woman well reputed, Cato's daughter. Think you I am no stronger than my sex, being so fathered and so husbanded? And here's where it gets really interesting. Because not only does Portia in Julius Caesar, the woman whom the note is about, describe herself in these terms, but so does Portia in Merchant of Venice. A woman who is not the Portia of the note, but who is Shakespeare's imaginative extrapolation on that person. Bassanio says of her, her name is Portia, nothing undervalued to Cato's daughter, Brutus Portia, nor is the wide world ignorant of her worth. And note how that last bit, that last line, is almost a reflection on what he has done in taking this name and transferring it to another character and honoring the original Portia in the transference. So Portia in the play commits suicide, does anybody remember? By swallowing burning coals. And here we go, that is what this says. Brutus kills himself by his own hand. His wife Portia swallows burning coals. How many playwrights were taking notes of that in their history books? Here is the description from the play of how she commits suicide. This is Brutus talking to Cassius. This is on the eve of the Battle of Philippi when the two of them get in a big fight, which is what Shakespeare does. Is that on the eve of the battle, on both sides, the leaders fall to quarreling with one another. And so Brutus tells Cassius, impatient of my absence and grief that young Octavius with Mark Antony have made themselves so strong, for with her death that tidings came. With this she fell distract, and her attendants absent swallowed fire. So let's move on to Fulvia, Antony's Roman wife. Now, this is a detail that many people, this easily goes past us, but I'm going to show you in just a minute how this note has an equally powerful relevance to the play. This just says the Perusian War waged with Antony and Fulvia. And this is a war waged actually, according to Caesar, not by Antony, but by Antony's wife Fulvia against him. She was a pretty fierce person. When Antony and Caesar meet for this international convocation, one of several complaints that Octavius makes against Antony is, he says to him, your wife and brother made wars upon me. Their contestation was theme for you. You, so he's trying to blame it on Antony, you were the word of war, which Antony, of course, says, no, I had nothing to do with that. She did that. I can't control her. Fulvia, now this is going to be a little more familiar to us if you've read or seen the play. This just says the death of Fulvia. Well, how about this? There's a long discussion in the play of Fulvia's death. And in fact, this part of what Shakespeare does with this is he develops it into a criticism, an implied criticism of Antony's character, because his response to this news is weird. The second messenger says, Fulvia, thy wife is dead. And his first thought is, where died she? And then a little bit later on, Antony tells Enobarbus, Fulvia is dead. Sir, Fulvia is dead. Fulvia, dead. Again, hello. Now we are to Cleopatra. Now there are, I said in the brochure, in the notes, I said there are 18 notes about Cleopatra. I counted again and got 20, but somewhere around that, there are 18 to 20 notes in here just about Cleopatra. And this is just a good note to begin with because it sort of describes the beginning in a way of the relationship here that Antony, persuaded by Cleopatra, decides to flee to Egypt. So there are three major ways in which Shakespeare's Roman plays vary from the other available European plays about Julius Caesar and his assassination. And I'm drawing here on the work of a scholar named Silvia Bigliazzi, who has written a marvelous article about this. She has read all of the other plays. They're not mostly not English, they're French and Italian plays. And so the three differences are that Shakespeare's emphasis on the role of the common people as a force in political life. Second, his development of the character of Antony as a foil to the basic Brutus-Caesar conflict. And finally, his interest in women. And actually, the third one is more mine than Professor Bigliazzi. She talks about the first two, but I'm going to add his interest in women as historical agents and enigmas of character worth embodying in drama. So you all know the climax of this play, which oddly happens right in the middle of the play, is the Battle of Actium. And this is the note taken by our annotator. The Battle of Actium between Caesar and Antony. It's the shortest battle in all of Shakespeare. Why? Because Antony and Cleopatra flee from it. And in fact, we get a description by a character named Scarus. This is what he says. He says, she, once being loofed, that's a difficult word, and I wish I could give you a good gloss on it, but let's just pass that for the moment. She being loofed, the noble ruin of her magic, Antony claps on his sea wing, and like a doting mallard, leaving the flight in height, flies after her. I never saw an action of such shame. Experience, manhood, honor, ne'er before did so violate itself. That's really almost the entire description of the battle. Oh, except for this little piece. He also says, on our side, like the tokened pestilence, where death is sure, yon rebodgered nag of Egypt, whom leprosy overtake, in the midst of the fight, when vantage like a pair of twins appeared. Twins, of course, signify fertility and good luck. When vantage like a pair of twins appeared, both as the same, or rather ours the elder, the breeze upon her like a cow in June, hoists sails and flies. Now, Scaurus is a character so elusive that he has inspired the conjecture that Shakespeare entirely invented the character. And that's because the man whose name did inspire the character didn't live until many years after Actium, and therefore could not actually have been its chronicler. But what Shakespeare carried over from this note in Cassius Dio is the idea of a character who so offended the emperor in his creative writing that, quote unquote, certain poem, poemate quodam, and in fact, although it doesn't say so here, this was actually what is described as a poem here was a drama. And it was a drama about, drawn on the ancient Greek tragedy about Atreus. And the emperor Tiberius believed that he himself was intended as the tyrannical object of the play's commentary. And not liking this very much, he forced Scaurus to commit suicide. In Shakespeare's play, like many others, suicide is a major topic. But that's a topic for another talk, since multiple Audley End notes deal with it. We've already seen 2 of them, but there are more. Scaurus does not commit suicide in the play, and yet recall this significant fact. How does he talk about Cleopatra? He calls her a nag in Egypt, wishes leprosy on her, and a cow in June. I would submit that these misogynistic comments are a reflection of the fact that the character is based on a real historical person who committed suicide for offending the monarch. Nobody else in this play talks about Cleopatra in those terms, certainly not Octavius, nobody else. Okay, now we're getting to the really fun stuff here. This note says, Cleopatra pretending, and that is the verb simulat. Let me read the Latin first. Cleopatra in tumulum se includens mortem simulat, qua audita Antonius se ipsum interficit, which means Cleopatra pretending to be dead encloses herself in her monument. Hearing this, qua audita, Antony kills himself. Now, there are 2 really interesting things about this. First is that word simulat, pretends. Of course, all of drama is pretending things. And one of the long understood remarkable qualities of Shakespeare's Cleopatra is her histrionic character, her ability to dramatically impress herself on others. The second is a little more subtle, the qua audita. This is an implied criticism, even in this note, of Antony. He has only heard of Cleopatra's action. He lacks any real knowledge of it, but despite that, impulsively sets about to kill himself, which he also fails at, by the way. Whereas Cleopatra, when she kills herself, does it in perfect high Roman style. Most importantly, consider how the reciprocal irony of the suicides expressed in this note is how fundamental that is to Shakespeare. It not only appears here, but also in what other play? Romeo and Juliet, exactly. So we just heard about Cleopatra locking herself in the monument and pretending to kill herself. These are the lines from Antony and Cleopatra, just to refresh your memory. To the monument, Mardian, go tell him I have slain myself. Say that the last time I spoke was Antony, and word it, prithee, piteously. Hence, Mardian, and bring me how he takes my death. To the monument. Again, the theatricality of the character is amply indicated in that speech. And this is, to me, the most interesting of all for several reasons. Now, this says in Latin, Caesar speaks with Cleopatra. And then it says in Greek, it's a participle. It says she blushing. Now, this is the only potential source text for this play in which Cleopatra blushes. That's the first interesting point. And the second one, of course, is that our author, our annotator, has made a note of it. So having first noted how Caesar sends his messengers Proculaeus and Epaphroditus before Cleopatra kills herself, both in Shakespeare's play and in these Audley End notes, she eventually meets Caesar face to face. And in agreement with these findings, the word she blushing is written in Greek. Blushing is one of Shakespeare's key markers of emotion. The word appears in variations 97 times in 28 plays, both narrative poems and also in the sonnets. Charlotte Spurgeon explains that Shakespeare is closely attuned to, quote, the color quickly coming and going in the human face. And he is conscious of the betraying change of color in the face as the signal flag of various emotions, fear, anger, astonishment, or pleasure. The OED reports that Shakespeare is already in Richard II, circa 1592, the first to use blushing as an adjective of color. His treasons will sit blushing in his face. So this is a metaphorical use of the concept of blushing. And just to mention weeping, kneeling, what am I forgetting? Nodding, all kinds of things. Shakespeare's fascinated by whatever is happening on the outside that indicates an inward change of emotion and uses all the possible elements of that. But blushing is a particularly significant one. Now, I mentioned this is the only source where Cleopatra blushes. It's even better than that. There are two manuscript traditions of this source. The blush only appears in one of them. In the other manuscript tradition, the reading is she leaping lightly to him. But one of the reasons why that reading has sometimes been favored is that there is no motivation for her to blush here in the source text. So what Shakespeare actually did here is he found the motive for the blush in Plutarch, another source from the life of Mark Antony. In that source, Cleopatra's treasurer Seleucus provides a motive when he refuses to support her claims against Caesar. I'll show you that scene in just a minute. Seleucus refuses to lie about Cleopatra's withholding of assets from Caesar. Cleopatra says, this is the brief of money. So in Plutarch, there are three people at this scene. She says, this is the brief of money, plate and jewels I am possessed of. 'Tis exactly valued. No petty things admitted. Where's Seleucus? Here, madam. This is my treasurer. Let him speak, my lord, upon his peril, that I have reserved to myself nothing. Speak the truth, Seleucus. Madam, I had rather seal my lips than to my peril speak that which is not. What have I kept back? Enough to purchase what you have made known. And then it is Octavius who says, this is how we know she blushes. He says, nay, blush not, Cleopatra. I approve your wisdom in the deed. I would have done the same damn thing. You're a good monarch, okay? So the scene of Seleucus and Cleopatra and Octavius is in Plutarch, but there is no blush in Plutarch. So I submit to you that what we're looking at in that annotation is one half of the creative process of composition, and the other half is in Plutarch, and we don't have Shakespeare's Plutarch, right? At least not yet. All right, I'm almost at the end. Thank you so much for your patience. This is my second to the last slide, or maybe third to the last slide with a note on it. This is Cleopatra, fearing lest she be led in triumph in Rome by Caesar, kills herself. It's an interesting thing. You will not find the word suicide in Shakespeare. And there's no word in Latin either that is the same thing as suicide. What we translate here as suicide is the sibi mortem consiscit in the last line there. And here again in a play, Cleopatra says to Dolabella, who has informed him that, that Caesar doesn't really intend well to her. He has lied to her. He'll lead me then in triumph. Madam, he will. I know it. And then actually a little bit earlier in the play, Cleopatra complains, shall they hoist me up and show me to the shouting varletry of censuring Rome? Rather a ditch in Egypt, be gentle grave unto me. This is one of the longest notes. And one of the things I will say about this evidence is that this adds to our body of written documents in Edward de Vere's handwriting by 10,000-fold. There are 1,800 annotations, at least in these books, and some of them are as long as this one. And this says, Proculaus and Epaphroditus, a freedman of Caesar, having been sent for face-to-face conversation with Cleopatra, apprehend her and are able to confiscate anything with which she might kill herself, and finally lead her to the court. This again is in the play in a couple different places. Octavia says, come hither, Proculaus, same name, same character. Go and say we purpose her no shame. Give her what comforts the quality of her passion shall require, lest in her greatness by some mortal stroke she do defeat us. For her life in Rome would be eternal in our triumph. Go, and with your speediest bring us what she says and how you find of her. And so he does that, and he says, this I'll report, dear lady. Have comfort, for I know your plight is pitied of him that caused it. And Gallus says, you see how easily she may be surprised. Here Proculaus and two of the guards ascend to the monument and come in behind Cleopatra. I don't know for sure if that stage direction is in the original folio version. It may not be, but that is how the modern editors make sense of this. And to Proculaus and the guard, Gallus says, guard her till Caesar come. Iris says, royal queen, because she's surprised. O Cleopatra, thou art taken, queen. Quick, quick, good hands, drawing a dagger. Hold, worthy lady, hold. And he seizes and disarms her. Again, the exact action described in the note. Do not do yourself such wrong. Octavius wants her alive. I forgot I have a little thing at the end here. I'm going to do a little transition here. In all, we have hundreds of annotations in these Audley End books that can be connected directly or indirectly to the Shakespeare plays, especially but not exclusively to Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. And we have a significant number of these that concern historical women whom Shakespeare features in the plays, as well as quite a number of women from history who are not in the plays, which also deserves study. But what if we had another book, one more literary in character, not a history book, in which we have Shakespeare's notes? Well, I'm here to tell you we actually do. And is there anybody here who was at the 2014 conference? So I talked a little bit about this book at that conference. This book, which is in the hands of a private Oxfordian collector, is now en route this fall to the Senate House Library in London. And that is because the Senate House Library already has a collection of important Oxfordian materials. And it contains over 400 underlined words and passages and 103 notes in Latin, Greek, and German. And let me just skip ahead. There's something here I need to read. I will know where I am. So in 2014, when I first presented these annotations, the forensic analysis of them was uncertain for several reasons. First, we had very few examples of de Vere's Latin and no Greek writing available for comparison. The second reason is that the annotations in this book are tiny. They are written with a really, really fine pen. They're about half the size of the other annotations that we've been looking at today. And what has happened since then is that we've got these Audley End annotations. And as I mentioned, now we've got more Latin and Greek than we know what to do with. So in the last few years, as I have studied the Audley End annotations, I've also done a pretty extensive comparative study of them compared to what is in the Seneca book. And this is actually the title page of a 390-page report that includes both forensic handwriting analysis and conceptual and linguistic evidence showing that this is Seneca's Shakespeare. So this is the title page. This is the 10 tragedies of Vennius Seneca, 1563. You can see that there is something that has been blotted on the title page. We don't know what that is, and we are not able to read it. At least I have not found anybody that has the technology to get underneath that to try to see what's been blotted out. But what we can see is the many annotations, the 100 or so annotations. I'm just going to show you 3. There are multiple annotations on Medea. So I'm sticking here with the theme of Shakespeare's women, only now we are going to think about not only the actual names of the female characters, but some of the mythical and ancient women who are inspirations for them. So this is just a quote from Robert Miola, a very fine scholar of Shakespeare's Seneca. And he says, Macbeth confronts Lady Macbeth, an astonishing evasion of the barely remarked wives in Holinshead. So again, what Shakespeare's doing is really different here. He's featuring the women in Holinshead into a creature of terrible presence and power. As has long been noted, Shakespeare achieves this expansion of the character by drawing again on Seneca's Medea. This says magic tricks. And again, this is about Medea. Next to this is the passage where the nurse describes what Medea is doing. She is plucking the deadly herbs and bleeding the snakes of their venom. And we get from Merchant of Venice a description that seems to be closely inspired by the note and the text in Seneca. In such a night, Medea gathered the enchanted herbs that did renew old Aeson. It's an interesting and important point that although her power is feared, she's also a medicinal doctor. So her medicine is ambiguous, and it can do, it works for both good and evil. And finally, this is the end, the trick of spelling things. This says the incantation, the spell of Medea. And this, to me, is one of the most interesting annotations in this book because it tracks with Shakespeare's profound interest in all things linguistical, especially specialized forms of speech in which he has an interest: prayer, curses, swearing, soliloquies, ceremonies, and spells or incantations. There is a whole discipline of linguistics, speech act theory, that deals with these special types of speech. They are called performatives because they're not describing the world, they are interacting with and transforming the social realities of the circumstances in which they are spoken. Norman Austin talks in his book about this. He gives this very simple example that we all recognize. If you say "I do" in a marriage ceremony, that is a contract. Okay, that's what the witnesses are called together to see. So, if you follow me so far, you will know that I have avoided the obvious Stratfordian response to this line of inquiry. And that isn't because there is no answer from this cliched criticism, but because I believe in looking at the evidence first. This new evidence submits that far from small Latin and less Greek, to which we have become well accustomed as good English majors, Shakespeare had much Latin, and as Earl Showerman asserts in his 2025 study, Greater Greek, he had Greater Greek. The other two texts that I've noted for you here, these are both referred to extensively in Dr. Showerman's really important and impressive book. That is Tanya Pollard's Greek Tragic Women on Shakespeare's Stages, published in 2017, and Alison Findley and Vasilike Markadou's Shakespeare and Greece, which is, they are the editors. This is a collection of essays. One of the contributors, Nick Paganopoulos, is here with us today and has already spoken to us about Plato. Earl says in his book that these are really strong and important indications that a big change is coming. These are not Oxfordians, and in fact, the Shakespeare in Greece book is published by Arden. It is published by Arden, okay? It doesn't really say Shakespeare had Greater Greek, but it heads in that direction. So, charting the long history of the attempt to make Shakespeare into an English genius purified of foreign and classical influences, Earl Showerman concludes that the avoidance of many clear signs of Shakespeare's knowledge of both Greek and Latin classical sources has become, quote, a philological Achilles heel to the traditional attribution of the plays. He draws attention to the convergence of recent scholarship, especially these two books that I've just discussed. And I believe that these are sort of like the right and left hand of what we have on this subject. The work that has been done by Tanya Pollard and by the contributors to the Arden edition and in Earl Showerman's book shows us that we should expect to be finding the Latin and Greek notes of the real author of the plays. Thank you for your attention. I'd be glad to answer any questions.